Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today, the Blue February. It's part of the Blue February series on water justice. Today, the theme of today's webinar is privatization of water and sanitation. What are the risks for human rights? I will be your host today. I'm Meera Karunananthan, based in Ottawa, Canada, on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I am the chair of the Blue Planet Project, also teach at Carleton University in Ottawa. And I'm thrilled to be today the host of today's webinar. We have a great discussion with some of the leading experts and activists around the world on water privatization. So it's quite an honor to be here in your company. Before we start, I would like to mention that we have live translation for today's webinar in Spanish and Portuguese. So you need to hit the button, the globe button at the bottom of the screen to access translation. Hay traducción hoy para el webinar y tienen para acceder a la traducción tienen que ¿cómo se dice? El botón, ir al botón en la parte inferior de la pantalla, el botón del mundo. Yo no sé cómo se dice en portugués. Somebody will have to explain that in Portuguese, maybe Leo.
Sim, posso traduzir. O que a Míriam está explicando é que temos traduções do inglês para o espanhol e para o português, em qualquer direção, e para acessar, vocês têm que clicar um globozinho escrito interpretação e selecionar o idioma na parte inferior da tela.
Thank you, Leo. We will start our first, so the way we'll organize the webinar today is we'll have a first round of questions where each speaker will speak for about 7 minutes, and then we'll do a second round of questions, a shorter round of questions for 5 minutes, and then I will open the floor to your questions. But feel free to add questions and comments into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And we will get the speakers to address those questions in the Q&A part of the webinar. So without further ado, I'll introduce my first speaker, David Hall. David Hall is a visiting professor in the business school at the University of Greenwich, London. From 2003 to 2013, he was director of the Public Services International Research Unit, the PSIRU. He researches the politics and economics of public services, public finance, and privatization in water, energy, waste management, healthcare, and other sectors. He's the author of several papers, reports. He's written 2 books. I mean, I know David for many, many years. In fact, I think many of us owe our knowledge and understanding of water privatization to David's groundbreaking research. David was probably one of the first people to kind of document what was happening around the world, and with these big corporations who were privatizing water. So really, David is part of the birth of our movement and our global struggle for water justice, our struggle against water privatization. So David, we will start actually today by looking at how how we started this work in documenting water privatization through your work in the UK. So what can we learn today? What are the valuable lessons we can learn today from your research on the history of privatization in the UK? And perhaps also address this question of cost. So I should actually mention as we go into this, the reason for launching this series on that we're calling Blue February is that we are leading up to a big global meeting on water being held at the UN. And this is something as a movement we've called for. We've challenged the private sector organizing these big meetings on water. We've asked for our governments to hold a meeting on water, but we are quite disappointed to see that privatization is still very much part of the supposedly public sector meeting on water, right? So our governments are getting together and promoting very much the same agenda. And one of the issues that's come up is that governments can't afford the cost of water. And so that we need the private sector to finance water and sanitation services.
Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, Meera and everyone else, it's a great pleasure and honor to be with you all. This is an inspiring gathering of people, and really great to be brought into it. So thank you for the invitation. To start by saying that, as you said, I spent a lot of time doing research around the world, but for the last few years I've been concentrating back home in the UK. And the picture I can offer, I think, is helpful for the questions, but really quite depressing in terms of what's actually happening after 30 years of privatization. So I'll start just by giving the framework, and then I just want to talk briefly about there's been a big negative economic impact in terms of forcing prices up by more than they might have been done otherwise. There's been a negative environmental impact, both in terms of management of water resources and in terms of managing sewage pollution in rivers and seas. And what I want to suggest is that the evidence shows very strongly that this is the result of the political economy of privatization itself. These are not just sort of technical problems that the UK is particularly badly hit by. There's the problems are worse because of privatization, its political economy. And then finally, to talk about the failure of regulation to control these things. We have an economic regulator of what we have an environmental regulator, the Environment Agency. Both of them have conspicuously failed to control these problems. And so I want to say that I think this is another problem intrinsic to privatization, that the expectation of regulators being able to control against the damage of privatization is going to fail. And the reason why it's failed here in the UK is that the private companies will always be able to exercise enough effort and use enough legal powers to game the regulatory system and weaken it and get their own way around it. Whereas under the regulatory system, as opposed to public ownership, we have a real, what can be called a democratic deficit. We can't exercise any direct democratic control over our water companies and say, don't do this, do that. And we don't have rights to information. And so the net result of those two things, the political economy of privatization and the democratic deficit of regulation, I think leaves us in a very bad situation, and one that is intrinsic to privatization as such. Would you like me to say a bit more about the things? There are two things maybe it's worth saying a bit more about. One is three things. One is the impact on the cost of living, because, Meera, as you said, in the UK, as everywhere else, we were told the reason for privatization is the public sector cannot afford the investment that we need to get up to modern standards. So we will privatize. These capitalists have loads of money. They will bring all their capital and invest it. Problem solved. One of the clearest things that's come out of economic analysis of 33 years now of privatization in the UK is that we've seen almost no investment of that capital by the owners. The firms are now owned and have been owned for many years by a mixture of private equity firms, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and other opportunists. They undoubtedly have a lot of capital, but they use it to buy the companies, but not to then invest in the companies. What we found is that there has been investment taking place, of course, otherwise the system would fall apart even worse than it has. But what the companies do is simply manipulate the system and the regulator so that they can charge consumers enough to pay for all the capital investment as well as the operation. We do have capital investment, but it's not done by capital. It's done by us. They're investing our money, not theirs. And that's really something quite important to hang on to, because this actually is a typical way of financing under public ownership. You can, I remember looking at what happened, what was happening in Porto Alegre sort of 20 years ago, and indeed what was happening in Toronto sort of nearly a century ago, that you need some investment. You put up the prices for 5 years to pay for the investment, and then the prices go down again. This is the way the public sector does it. But this is what the private companies are doing as well, except they are then taking big dividends out of the system. So that's the way it works in terms of lack of investment, but prices going up. In terms, just quickly, of the sewage pollution, we're seeing really bad sewage flooding because of what's called combined sewer overflows, where the sewers are carrying both sewage and rainwater draining off the roads. That's a common problem in at least Europe and North America, because that's how the systems were designed, and they're not got the capacity now to cope with things. But what we're finding in the UK, and there's now a very specific academic study showing this, as well as citizen reports, is that sewage flooding is being used as a routine by the water companies here, because they simply have decided not to invest money in increasing the capacity of wastewater treatment plants. If they'd done that, we wouldn't have half the sewage flooding we have. But it's not just a problem of climate change and population growth here in the UK, it is a problem of privatization. And finally, quickly on regulation, why have our regulators not worked? Well, 4 years ago, when I was talking to a meeting in London about the importance of public ownership, the woman who was then CEO of the regulator, Ofwat, said, "Can't you imagine these things being achieved, these objectives being achieved by regulation?" To which I replied, "Well, I thought we'd had an experiment for 29 years. That was enough. It had failed already." And she looked shocked, but she's less shocked now because she's moved from being chief executive of Ofwat, the regulator. She's now a director of Thames Water, one of the private water companies. Who is chair of Ofwat these days? Is it some independent academic authority? No, it's Johnson Cox, who was chief executive of Anglian Water, again, one of the water companies. This is a classic example of what the books call regulatory capture, which is a phrase that speaks for itself, and it's what we watch, we see. So I just want to add those three specific points to illustrate the general analysis of the problems we have. We continue to fight, I want you to know, but these are the characteristics of the problems. Thanks, I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, David. That was such a great overview of the challenges we're facing, I think, at this stage, where we've seen huge victories in remunicipalization. So we've seen hundreds of communities in the last 20 years push back against private operators, push their governments to cancel contracts. And on the one hand, that's a huge victory for citizens movements and communities around the world. And we'll hear from Sigit Budiono from Jakarta next. But the problem is, as you explained so, so beautifully, the political economy of privatization is such that then we don't come back to a very strong public sector. When you remunicipalize, a lot of work has to be done to get the kind of public sector services that we need. And so this is, and Sigit can tell us a little bit more. I do think with Jakarta, we've got one of the most inspiring struggles against water privatization, one of the most inspiring struggles, an emblematic struggle of remunicipalization, and yet ongoing problems with a public sector that has been gutted and that has been destroyed, right, by these arrangements that were made with the private sector. So without further ado, I'll introduce Sigit, who is working with, who works with KruHa International. KruHa is a national network of impacted communities fighting for water justice on different levels to protect water resources, to protect their communities from privatization. He works as a researcher with the Secretariat of KruHa. He works on issues related to extractivism and the commodification of water. Sigit, I know Sigit's having some connectivity issues, so he's going to probably turn his screen on to say hello, and he might need to turn it off in a bit.
Okay, hello everyone. Good evening or good morning. My name is Sigit. I will try to presenting the Jakarta water privatization case. I will try to divide into 4 sections. For the beginning, the privatization of Jakarta water is the story of powerful multinational that use the World Bank and compliant dictatorship to grab control of major city water works. Since 1945, pipe water supply in Jakarta has been managed by a local owned government company called the Pamjaya. And the privatization of water services in Jakarta began in 1991 under the Water Sector Adjustment Project with a 92 million loan from the World Bank. And in 1997, in alliance with the Suharto family and Suharto cronies, Thames and Suez won favorable concession without public consultation or bidding. And 25 years concession agreements were signed between Pamjaya and the Thames Water International, who took Sigit Haryudanto, the eldest son of President Suharto, as its partners, called PT Aetra, to service the eastern part of the city. And Suez worked together with Salim Group, which one of the largest conglomerate in Indonesia, in the crony of Suharto, and formed PT Palija to service the western part of the city. Over the years, there were some changes in ownership and the terms of the cooperation agreement. The second one, the contract, the process of the assignment agreement, there was no open bidding. The process has been described as a collusive corruption. The private companies responsible for all aspects of water supply, including production, distribution, and revenue collection. For this function, Pamjaya paid the private companies water charge. The shortfall between water charge and the revenue from the collection of water tariff was borne by Pamjaya, which assured the private operator assured returns. In turn, the private operator was supposed to undertake investment to meet the water supply requirement and the expand of the service coverage. It was proposed that by the end of the contract period, 100% of the household in Jakarta would have pipe water access. The result, at the end of the contract period, the target is far from the reality. According to official estimates, the service coverage has stagnated at around 65%. The company steadily grew high annual revenue, but invested very little of this in developing or maintaining the water supply infrastructure. excluded, marginalized, and poor household, DPRD members or Pamjaya official admit that they are unable to intervene and serve this area, which they call as a gray area or illegal area, because projects proposed to increase water supply must be approved by private operators. Arrangement with the private companies have been cheated by the state agencies as a barrier to developing water services for these communities. The communities in practice, they are obliged to rely on alternate mechanisms, which are often exploitative and expensive. For example, master meter. And even in the area serviced by the pipe network, the quality of service is unsatisfactory. Water supply is intermittent, and the quality of water is not potable, necessitating a coping mechanism like storing water, supplementing from other sources, including groundwater and bottled water. Further, there are extremely high rates of non-revenue water, approximately 45%, which is attributed to leakages in aging water infrastructure and illegal water use. Contract with the private companies also result in financial losses for Pamjaya and for the state in general. The water charge mechanism, the internal rate of return causes a shortfall. So this is counted as a debt that must be paid by the Pamjaya. The debt claims that Pamjaya has to pay even reach hundreds of billions to trillions of rupiah, as proposed by Palija, estimated to be between 900 billion up to 1.8 trillion. On another occasion, Palija claimed that the shortfall was up to 10 trillion. In the end, I think a couple months ago, Pamjaya agreed to pay off 441 billion rupiah in error to the company. And the last one, the contemporary situation, the evolution of Jakarta water supply stands at a critical juncture as the cooperation agreement with the two private operators came to an end on last 31st January 2023. But the problem don't end there. The new wave of privatization will even get stronger with the big push from the central government to continue implementing PPP in various public service sectors, including water services. Likewise, with the case of Jakarta Water Service, there will be no efforts to end privatization or remunicipalization as happened in Global North and so on, but there will be only new forms of privatization with the various phases. New cooperation agreement has been made between Pamjaya and PT Moya Indonesia, scheduled to start in February 2023. PT Moya is currently owned by the Salim Group, the same actor when the privatization started. Even Salim Group also control the water services in cities nearby Jakarta, Tangerang, Bekasi. And there will be a separation between the upstream and downstream function. The upstream function is being convert to private actor, while the downstream function will be handled by Pamjaya. But the investment in expanding the pipe network to achieve better service coverage will also be contracted out to private actor, who will undertake the construction and transfer it to Pamjaya. Technically, Pamjaya will only be responsible for the operation of the entire distribution network. The concern raised by the previous director of Pamjaya and KPK, the Corruption Eradication Commission, who looked into the earlier proposal of extending contract with ITRA, remain sidelined. According to them and some other sector experts, the component of water production has assured high financial returns and no significant investment or risk. It is the downstream component investing in expanding distribution network and operating and maintaining the distribution infrastructure that require difficult investment and significant risk. In this arrangement, the private operator is handed over the golden egg, while the state utility is burdened with the difficult tasks. In this post-concession model, the change in regulation, which limit the participation of private water in distribution, is used to shield the private actors from difficult responsibilities while handing over them the safe and high revenue generating components. However, there has been very little open discussion or community involvement regarding the performance evaluation under the old contract or the terms of the new cooperation agreement. And the agreement are negotiated between the parties, the PAMJAI and the private companies only, privately, without public scrutiny or debate. The cooperation agreement and the amendment to the agreement, including some arrangement for repassing and rebalancing, are treated as confidential. There is no open and transparent discussion about the performance of the parties. The basis for this arrangement is also unclear. The several evaluations have been carried out by a team of experts, but the reports and recommendations from these studies are not in the public domain. There is no assessment of the safeguard and mechanism required to operationalize the cooperation agreement from 2021. And for the people, we are in the phase of reconsolidate and we'll try to continue the fight. I think that's for my presentation for now. Thank you, Meera.
Thank you, Sigit. And I think this is really important what KruHa is doing, and the information that we're getting from Sigit on the aftermath of privatization in the global south and the particularities, the specificities of the challenges of remunicipalization in the global south in the aftermath of privatization. And I think Indonesia is probably one of the most egregious cases, because you had the World Bank push for privatization under a dictatorship. You had the private company come in with one of the sweetest deals we've ever heard of, right? They were given 22% profit margins that were then protected, that were indexed against inflation, which meant no matter what was happening with the economy in Indonesia, that the private company was going to keep making these huge profits. And what that meant was then when the government couldn't get those, couldn't charge the people for those profits because people couldn't afford to pay for their water services, and the public sector got into bigger and bigger and bigger debt, which now they're on they're on the hook for with the private sector, right? So you've got this completely destroyed public sector, and what do we do? And I guess we can talk about it in the next round when we talk about alternatives and solutions, that we need to think about strategies that address some of the challenges that communities are facing in the global south, whereas in the global north, we can talk about buying the private sector out. In the global south, it's had such hugely detrimental impacts, like what we're seeing in Indonesia, and it's part of bigger ongoing strategies against, or challenges, struggles against privatization. Next we have Míriam Planas to talk about a remunicipalization campaign in the global north. It's been a very challenging remunicipalization campaign in the global north against Agua de Barcelona. Míriam is with Engineers Without Borders, Spain. They have been part of not only this local campaign in Barcelona against privatization, but recognizing that Agua de Barcelona is a big, powerful entity, and now a subsidiary of Suez, so an even bigger, more powerful entity, that it's important to build. Míriam and our friends at Engineering Without Borders have been part of, been leading global efforts against privatization, and have been very much part of the information sharing and the building of communities of common struggle globally. Míriam holds an MSc in chemical engineering with a specialization in water treatment and sustainability. She's been a member and activist with Engineering Without Borders since 2005, where she has worked since 2016 on the water as a right, not a commodity campaign. She's the spokesperson for the network, for the platform Agua es Vida, which brings together environmental, human rights, and other movements in Catalonia, calling for a citizens' initiative for water, which was proposed in Barcelona in 2018. So here to tell us more about that is Míriam Planas.
Thank you very much. I've got a bit of a flu, so it affected my voice a little bit. It is a great pleasure to be here with you today, to be able to talk to Vera David again. And I will be talking about the case that was presented by Catalonia. We'll put you into the context. In Catalonia, we have approximately 80% of the population, which is supplied by a private management of water. And we realized that, in fact, looking at the different campaigns and the different struggles for water in the south, because in 2000 that wasn't a problem in Catalonia. We didn't realize it was a problem, but knowing more about the struggles in the global south and in Latin America mainly, that's where we discovered that Aguas de Barcelona, that was privatizing the water, not only in the global south, but in our homes as well. So we realized that it wasn't just an anecdote, but it really affected 80% of the population in Catalonia, whilst in Europe, the percentage of private management is 20%. So, whilst we have in Europe just 80% public management, we have 80% of private sector in Catalonia, and 70% only has one operator, meaning under different names, under different ways, the names of companies. 70% of the population of Catalonia, we consume the water of people that have shares of Aguas de Barcelona, and this have a direct effect on the knowledge that there is. That this is much bigger than the knowledge that basically the municipalities have of the government. So we started to research that in 2008, 2010.
And we have a campaign to remunicipalize. For more than 10 years, we have gone over 84% of the population to 78%. It may be look small, 6%, but it was a great struggle. We have 32 municipalities that have regained the water to the public services, and this was an enormous kind of job. We always say that to privatize may be done at any day, any year, but to get it back to public services takes a long time. You have to wait for the contract to finish. You have to see if there's any provision that wasn't complied with. And all of this needs a lot of courage. It's very difficult. All the laws go against this. So the consequences that we saw in Catalonia from this private management in the social movements that were forbidden in 2014 and 2015. But up until then, it was a reality. In the middle of the economic crisis of 2007 and 2008, people didn't know. People had no water, and thanks to the social movements, there is no longer cuts in the water and the water supply. And now we have to take care of this. Even if we have legislation that forbids that. This is one of the things we'll have to do when you have a private management or without any participation of the population. On the other hand, it's the increase in the tariffs, in the fees that you pay for the water. We have the cubic meters, the most expensive ones, calculated by the Catalonian Agency of Water. Although the private management happens in in medium and large municipalities, we pay the costs and benefits, or the case of the mixed company in Barcelona, it's 10 million annual euros. We pay that in order to have access to the private company. And I believe that in all the cases where we have the ability to hear the Aguas de Barcelona, we used to pay this value without no return, just to have the knowledge about the private company. And this knowledge is to see how they manage the water in the municipalities, and we pay that in our bills. The other thing is the capacity of the city governments to know their network, what investments do they need. So when the concessions end, the city governments have no knowledge to recover this. And the last consequence we observed in Catalonia, and it's not the most serious one because all of them are serious, but the abuse of power of this corporation. Because in Catalonia, besides the 32 municipalities that recovered the water to public services, we will have others that will do away with the concession, so they have to re-municipalize their water. 40 municipalities were denounced when they approved democratically to recover the waters. It is taken to the courts to stop that. And this makes the inequality of power produced, and I think Leo is going to speak about this, the inequality of power that is produced against these small municipalities that want to recover the ownership of the water, and they need legal support so they can confront this situation. Then the well-known case and the most serious we've had so far, and with this I conclude, is the citizens' initiative in Barcelona in the mixed company that has a contract until 47, and from the civil society we made a citizens' initiative with more than 20,000 signatures to make a consultation of the water, and this consultation was blocked with 9 legal appeals. And so the Chamber of the Public Companies placed resources to interfere in this consultation, and also they had the contest for electronic votes, so they tried to block this. And with the citizens' initiative, not only the judicial power, they place this at the interest of their own interest, and they can perpetuate this. But there is also the power of the media. In Barcelona, we see daily advertising promoting the waters of Barcelona without any citizen choosing who is going to supply water to you. So we hear that all the time in the radio, in the TV. So it's a waste of money that should not go to publicity, but to campaigns to inform about the management of the water.
Gracias, Míriam. That's great. I think we've learned so much from Engineering Without Borders, what people's power, what public power can look like, what people-driven movement can look like. So even where in Barcelona, we're still waiting for the big victory, although there have been many, remunicipalizations, as you said, in Catalonia and throughout Spain, that we've learned so much about what people can do to democratize management of water, right? You've pushed from the streets to have access to information, to make demands, to get, the citizens' initiative. So those are all such great lessons for the rest of us about how to engage people in decision-making around water. And maybe when we come back, we can also talk about the citizens observatories that that you've been involved in Spain. But next we'll go to Leo Heller, who is the former Special Rapporteur on the human right to water and sanitation. He has a PhD in epidemiology from the Federal University of Minas Gerais. He's a former professor in the Federal University of Minas Gerais and the coordinator of the international cooperation at ONDAS. He's a researcher in the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation in Brazil. And I should also thank ONDAS for actually initiating this Blue February initiative that, mobilizing all of us to pay closer attention to what was happening at the UN. And as we've said previously, the UN is a big machine. It's a big entity that most of us don't understand. And we've, in the last, decade or so, we've had openings through having Leo Heller as a special rapporteur, and now Pedro. It's given us a greater voice at the UN. I know Leo has done so much work to engage social movements in the reports and the research that he did as special rapporteur, and was and produced significant research on the impacts of privatization. And this was really important in the global debates where private corporations and many governments were arguing that water privatization was not in violation of the human right to water, that it was compatible with the human right to water. And Leo's report really challenged that perspective. So Leo will tell us a little bit more about, I know there's some questions in the chat on how to engage at the UN, but I think it will help us to understand the tensions between water privatization and the human right to water, and how we can use the human right to water as a tool to challenge privatization.
Thank you, Meera. I will speak in Portuguese, if you don't mind.
I will speak in Portuguese. It's a great pleasure to be here with Meera and Sigit and to share this discussion with all of those who are watching us. And answering Meera, I will speak about the process that led to my last report from 2020 about the privatization of the water and sanitation services and potential violations to human rights. The elaboration of the report was very difficult, very hard. I got many attacks and demands so that I shouldn't work with this issue. This is not an important issue for human rights. Some people said that, but on the other hand, many social movements welcomed my report. I noticed along the elaboration of the report, with the research, with the collection and review of the literature about possible violations of human rights when they privatized, I noticed that only to mention violation cases could make the report frail. And they can say, well, you are getting an isolated case, but public management also has problems. And with this, you do not demonstrate that there could be violations because you make no comparisons. So it occurred to me not only to present
violações
which
podem ocorrer, e
violations and
casos,
cases,
exemplos,
examples and
ilustrações para
illustrations
essas
of
violações,
them,
mas
but
é
it's
fundamentar o
fundamental
relatório em
to
marco
have an
analítico,
analytical and
conceitual,
conceptual
né, que desse
milestone that
base,
gives
né,
us
para
a
justificar
ground to
essa tese, digamos
justify
assim,
this
essa hipótese de
hypothesis
que a
that
privatização pode levar a violações de direitos
privatization
humanos, né?
leads to
E eu quero falar
human
pouco sobre
rights
esse marco analítico. É
breaches.
marco
So this
baseado em três elementos,
milestone
em
is
três
based
conceitos,
upon
né, que
three
são próprios
concepts that
da
have to
gestão
do with
privada dos
private
serviços de água e saneamento
management
e que
and that
frequentemente ocorrem
frequently
e ocorrem
happen
de uma
in a
forma combinada,
combined
né?
way.
E a
And the
combinação
combination
desses
of these
fatores é que
factors
leva a amplificar
broaden
os
the
riscos
risks
à
and the
violação dos direitos
violation
humanos.
against
Então, esses
human
fatores
rights.
são, em primeiro
The
lugar,
factors are,
o
first of
fato
all, the
de
fact
que o
that the
serviço de água e
water
saneamento é um
and
monopólio natural,
sanitation
né? Isso é
service
muito
is a
importante a gente
monopoly. It's
entender, né,
very
que o serviço
important
de
to
água e saneamento
understand that
é
it is
diferente do
different from
serviço,
the
por exemplo, de
telephone
telefonia,
services or
correios
post
ou
office
outros, né?
services.
Segundo, é
Second,
que há frequentemente uma
frequently there is an
obsessão das
obsession
empresas
by the
em maximizar
corporations
seus
in
lucros, né? As
maximize their
empresas não se
profit.
contentam
They are
a
not
produzir lucros,
happy
mas elas
with
procuram
having some
maximizar
profit.
os
They want to
lucros. Em
maximize
terceiro
it.
lugar,
Thirdly,
a chamada
the
assimetria de poder, que
asymmetry
a
of
Míriam
power
mencionou
that was
há pouco, né?
mentioned recently.
E eu
I
penso
think
que os
that
três
these
relatos
three
que me precederam,
reports
né, de
that
David,
from
Míriam e
David
Sigit,
Meera
ilustram bem esses
and
três aspectos, né?
Sigit,
Então, em
they
primeiro lugar,
all emphasize these three
o
aspects.
caso
In
do
the
monopólio
case of the
natural, o fato de o serviço
natural,
ser um monopólio
that
natural,
it is a
traz
natural
grandes
monopoly,
desafios
it
para
brings a
a
lot of
regulação, né? Isso,
challenges
para mim,
for
é cada vez
the
mais claro, é muito
legislation,
mais
for the
desafiante
regulations.
o regulador
It's much more
regular
difficult
água
to
e saneamento do
regulate
que
water and
regular mercado
sanitation than to
competitivo
regulate a
em que há mais de
competitive
prestador de
market
serviço,
with more
né?
than
É
one
muito comum
service
ocorrer,
renderer.
como o David disse,
The
a
capture
captura do
of the
regulador pelo
regulator by
regulado, pelo
the
prestador de serviço.
service
É muito
renderer
comum,
is very
mesmo que
common.
o
Even if the
regulador tenha
regulator has
eventualmente
good
boas intenções,
intentions
não
and
consiga
cannot
enquadrar o
really
prestador de serviço. É
control
muito
the
frequente
service
que
renderer,
o regulador não tenha
it's very
meios,
common
né,
that
para enquadrar
he
o
would not
regulado,
have the
né?
means
Caso
to
muito exemplar foi o
control
de Buenos
the
Aires, né?
service
Em
renderer.
que
A very
o
common case
regulado
happened in
descumpria
Buenos
o
Aires
contrato, né,
when they
sistematicamente, o regulador
were constantly
buscou aplicar
uncomplying
uma
with the
multa
rules.
ou
The
várias multas
regulator
ao
applied
regulado,
many
e o
fines,
regulado, o
and the
prestador de serviço
multinational
multinacional,
would
falava:
say, if
se
you
me
find
multar, eu vou
me,
ter
I'll
menos
have
recursos para
less
investir, menos ainda,
resources to
vou ter que pagar a
invest.
multa,
I
não é
have to
possível.
pay the
Então, cria-se uma
fines.
tensão,
And
né, que
so it's
é
a
de
question
difícil
of
solução.
difficult
E o
solution.
fato de ser
This
um monopólio
national
natural
monopoly
explica parcialmente isso.
explains
A
that the
maximização de lucros, acho que ficou muito
maximization
claro aí em todas as
profits, it's
apresentações, né?
very
Sigit
clear.
mostrou
Sigit
muito
showed that
claramente, né,
very clearly,
como
how
na
Indonesia and
Indonésia, em Jacarta em
Jakarta,
particular,
the
o
service
prestador não
renderer would
investia,
never
nem produzia
invest,
lucros,
produce
transferia
profits and
dividendos, né?
dividends, and the
A
last
última prioridade
priority
era
was to
investir,
invest.
né? Então, a
So the
maximização de lucros
maximization
tem
of
duas
profit
dimensões,
has
né?
two
Uma
dimensions.
é
One
quanto
is the
menos
less you
investimento,
have
melhor,
investment,
né? E outro é quanto
and the
mais
other one
receita,
is
melhor,
the
né?
more you
Quanto
have
mais receita, melhor, em
income,
geral,
the
leva a
better.
aumentos
Then you
exorbitantes
can
de tarifa.
increase the
Vimos
tariff
isso
very
na apresentação do
enormously.
David,
We saw that in
vimos Míriam
David's
falar que
presentation. We saw
são,
Meera
se eu entendi
saying that
bem,
it's
0,5 euros mais alto o metro
0.5
cúbico
euros
de
more
água na gestão privada
than
comparado com a
in the
pública,
private
né?
sector
Então, há uma pressão
than
por
in the
parte
public sector.
do
So there is a
prestador de
part
serviço
from
para
the
que
service
as tarifas
renderer
aumentem,
to
para também que
increase
se
the
cobrem
tariffs and
serviços
to
que não são usuais,
charge for
serviços
auxiliary
auxiliares, né?
services, to
Contratar
contract
subsidiárias, né, para fazer
subsidiaries
seus
to carry out
serviços.
their
Então, a
work. So the
maximização do lucro é algo
maximization of
muito
the profit
frequente, muito
is very
problemático,
frequent,
explica
and
por que
it brings up
no
a
Reino
big
Unido não tratam
problem,
os
and it
esgotos adequadamente,
explains
né,
how
por exemplo,
you
e
are
descumprem as leis ambientais,
uncomplying
porque não
with
é
the
prioridade colocar
regulations.
recursos,
You
né,
cannot
dos sócios, né, dos shareholders, das
withdraw
empresas em
resources from the
atividades que não geram receitas
shareholders
imediatamente.
And
E
the
a assimetria de
asymmetry
poder é
of
outro
power
caso,
is
né,
another
importante,
important case,
porque
because
muitas
many
vezes
times
o
the
prestador de
service
serviço é muito
renderer is
poderoso, são
very
empresas
powerful, a
multinacionais, muito bem
multinational
preparadas,
with a
tem um corpo
legal
jurídico
body that
muito
is
bem
well organized,
organizado, né,
that
que
knows a
conhece
lot
muito mais
more
das
of the
leis do
laws
que os
and
reguladores, do
the
que os poderes locais, do
regulators
que os
and the
governos,
governments,
e
and they
usam
use
isso de
this
forma
in a very
muito
efficient
eficiente, né,
way to
para defender
defend
seus
their
interesses e
interests
para
and to ensure
assegurar que a
that
gestão
the
privada
private
permaneça,
management
né, não seja
continues and
cancelada,
is
para que
not
os lucros
canceled
sejam
and their
garantidos.
rights are
Eu creio que nós
guaranteed.
vimos isso muito
We
claramente,
saw that
tanto na apresentação do
both
Sigit quanto
in
da Míriam,
Mira's
né, sobre o que
presentation
ocorreu
as
nesses locais.
in
O David
Sigit's
falou tanto em
presentation.
déficit
David
democrático, né,
spoke
quanto
about
em
the
falta de
deficit, the
direito à
democratic
informação, né, isso está
deficit.
absolutamente
This is
relacionado
absolutely
com a
linked to
simetria
the
de poder. Então,
asymmetry of
eu queria
power. So
trazer
I'd
esse
like
marco
to
conceitual, porque eu penso que ele
um,
nos ajuda a
bring
entender
this
não cada um dos
conceptual
casos, né, como que
framework.
eles incidem
I was
para
saying Meera, but it's
colocar
actually
riscos à violação dos direitos
Minam
humanos.
Planas.
Só para
So
concluir,
just to conclude,
acho
I
que
think
também é
it's
muito
very
importante
important
nós
to
sempre
always think about
pensarmos
the
na dificuldade
difficulty
de
to
reverter a
revert
privatização. Isso é um
privatization.
fato
This is a
muito
fundamental
fundamental, né,
fact
que
that
foi
was
muito bem
well
explicitado por Míriam e por Sigit.
explained by
Aqui no Brasil, por
Míriam and
exemplo, estão
Sigit.
firmando
Here in
contratos
Brazil, they
recentes,
are
né,
signing
com 35
contracts for
anos de duração.
35
É
years. It's
muito
very
duro, muito
difficult
difícil
for
para
the
o poder local
local
cancelar o
power to
contrato
cancel
antes
the
disso. É
contract
possível,
before
né?
that.
Mas
It's
é um
possible, but
preço
it's a political,
político,
economic, and
econômico,
legal price
legal, né,
that
que muitos
many
prefeitos, né,
mayors prefer
não
not to
concordam,
deal with or
não
do not
priorizam, né?
prioritize.
Então, é
So
sempre
it's
muito importante
always
que os
very
municípios pensem
important that the
10 vezes, né,
municipalities
antes de
think
tomar uma
10
decisão
times
na
before
direção da
they
privatização,
think
porque
of
vão ocorrer riscos de
privatization,
direitos
because
humanos e
the
vai ser muito
risks to
difícil
human rights
reverter
will
esse
be
processo, né? Nós sabemos que
much,
existem
and the
muitos
difficulty
casos de
in
remunicipalização, mas nem
remunicipalizing
todos ocorrem
is
de
a
uma
very
maneira
difficult
tranquila,
process. There
sem
is
ônus,
always a
né, para o
cost.
poder público. Então, eu
So
fico por
I'm
aqui e
here
à
and I'm
disposição para o
available
debate.
to
Obrigado.
anything you need. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leo. I think thank you for this excellent overview. There have been, many debates in our movement about whether the human right to water is a useful tool. And we know that for many of us, it has been, and in many local contexts, it has been, but it's also very important for us to have the language to use it as a weapon in our fight against privatization, and specifically at the UN, where it is one of the only tools we have to fight privatization. And it's important, as we've learned, to look at global processes and what's being discussed at the global level. So that report is extremely valuable, and I hope we can post it, or at least link to it, in our People's Water Forum website. I'd invite if some of the folks from the People's Water Forum can post a link in the chat. This is this is a loose network, or I don't know how we're calling ourselves, a coalition of water justice groups. We invite all of you to join if you haven't already. That we started calling ourselves the People's Water Forum actually after the last alternative water forum in Dakar. We've been organizing as an alternative, fighting the World Water Forums. And then in our last alternative World Water Forum in Dakar, we decided we're not an alternative, we are the People's Forum. We represent the perspectives of people and of impacted communities, of social movement. So we invite you all to join or to visit the website to get more information on how we've been organizing in the lead up to this water conference at the UN. So in the next round, we've just heard we've had a very heavy discussion on privatization over the past few decades and the impacts of privatization, human rights violations of private water companies. In the next round, I'll give you a chance, I'll give you 5 minutes each to respond to each other, but to also emphasize what we've learned about solutions and alternatives. Something a little more hopeful before we lead into the Q&A. So perhaps I'll start this time with well, maybe we'll go back in the same order. So I'll start with David, and then Sigit, Míriam, and Leo.
Okay. Well, I mean, one comment is I'm always amazed. I've been looking at this kind of stuff for 25, 30 years, and I'm still shocked at some of the things that are going on, both in my own country and in Spain and Indonesia. These, you know, the simple attempts that Míriam was talking about to stop and suppress democratic initiatives for people's referendum. I mean, this is kind of brutal, cynical corporate behavior, and we can see the same here. I'll offer 2 or 3 thoughts that occurred to me while listening to all the other contributions, and the first from Sigit's contribution. One of the things that struck me is he was talking about the guaranteed returns that are built into the system, and the lack of information in the system, which again reminds me, again, it's extreme in Indonesia. I remember going to a meeting once where some activists had got hold of the annual accounts of the water company, the Palija, and the CEO of Palija, who was present at the meeting, was severely critical that someone should actually publicly discuss their company accounts, that, you know, they were meant to be secret, great secrecies. However, the general point I wanted to make, a comment that occurred to me out of what Sigit said, was to as it were, remember the kind of imperial role, post-colonial role of these kind of systems, and the frameworks for them. I mean, one thing I remember from early on in the concessions, in the concession, after the fall of Suharto, who was under whom the concessions were initially initiated, there was a move immediately afterwards to introduce a really stringent price cap that would have broken those profit guarantees. And at the time, 1/2 of Jakarta was run by a subsidiary of Thames Water, and the British ambassador, no less, summoned the Indonesian president and said, "We do not want you to allow these price caps to go through. It would interfere with the profits of our company, Thames Water, so please stop it." And it was stopped. I also remember that there was something similar happened in Mexico at one point, and so there were still these kind of imperial and post-colonial relationships going through. The second thing, when Leo was talking about the importance of comparative analysis, or the challenge that people make of, oh, you know, things go wrong with public companies too, and yeah, but firstly, there's the general reasons with public companies that they are not profit maximizers trying to extract every dollar out of the local water system to be taken to an offshore tax haven somewhere. So there's a basic difference, but also there's practical differences. And one of the things that we perhaps ought to be more confident about is saying that the idea that the private sector brings increased efficiency is as much of a myth as the idea that they bring investment. And to suggest there's sort of 2 or 3 ways we can elaborate that. But one is, and the simplest one, and one that I spent more of my life on than I would like to have done, is simply the number of academic studies there now are by academic economists, usually trying to prove that the private sector is more efficient. And while the result they come up with time and time again is no, there is no greater efficiency in private sector operators. That's not just in some countries or some sectors. it's all over the world, and it's in sector after sector after sector, energy, water, etc. So this actually is one of the strongest kind of economic facts established. I did a long attempted a long sort of compilation of some of the evidence at one point that I can circulate a link to, but we should be perhaps more confident about that. The second thing, however, is to do something that Míriam has done, I know, which we don't talk about doing as much as we should. Those studies I was mentioning that deal with comparative efficiency use a mainstream economics definition of efficiency, which is really oriented towards producing a good sort of financial result. And they're not even better at that. But we want to go beyond that, because there are things that matter to us much more than just getting a good financial result. And one of the things that I know Míriam has done is to actually work at producing a series of, as it were, people's indicators of what, how the water and sanitation system can be evaluated as to whether it's performing to deliver the public goods that we want. Míriam, I don't know, when I last asked you about it, you said that you were thinking of translating it into English, but hopefully it's at least more widely available now beyond Catalonia. But I think we should we should learn from that and have the confidence to try and say, look, we can build better systems than just trying to keep up with private sector in terms of efficiency. Yeah, those are the main comments that I'd offer in terms of what's happened.
Great, thank you, David. I know it's good to see how active you've been. I know when you said you would retire, I don't know how many years ago, we said we wouldn't quite let you retire, and we've been true to that. And it's good to see also how active you've been. I'd love to see the compilation of evidence you've put together, so please circulate, and we will try and circulate also more broadly. And we'll get to Míriam on the people's indicators, but before that, I'll go to Sigit. Sigit, what positive things, what hopeful things have we learned from the struggle in Indonesia? What can we look forward to? What are some of the solutions you see in the future?
Actually, I don't know what the best alternative for Indonesia right now, considering the current situation from the national until local Jakarta. Some say public-to-public partnership or other, but I think it is still too far to say that regarding the contemporary situation. When we try to study in the new contract together and with help from Privatization, one of the students that currently doing research about our service in Jakarta, we try to discuss many things, including alternative or proposal. We come with some conclusion. The people of Jakarta who have long opposed the privatization of Jakarta's water services are still not seen as a fundamental actor in managing Jakarta's water services going forward. For Indonesia, I think the first term that is currently needed is, I think, the privatization, or we need the privatization movement. There should be a big push nationally to stop new forms of privatization through the mechanism that the government call it as KPBU or PPP. The right to water also need to be understood regarding the rights of the people. The rights of the people in articulating their interests, their voices must be heard and positioned above mere business interests in the process of providing good drinking water services, so that the provision of water that is fair and accountable is guaranteed. In this context, the contestation of the right water needs to shift from rhetorical contest to reject the replication of existing modes of extraction and exclusion in new forms. So I think that's what's in my mind right now.
No, I think that's, yeah, wonderful. That's great in terms of, yes, we need to think about more than just anti-privatization rhetoric, but also about all of the new forms of extractivist, water and sanitation service delivery, right? And the ways in which the private sector operates outside of the kind of big public-private partnerships. And so I think that's important. And I would say, I've drawn a lot of hope from the movement in Indonesia. I think what you've done is significant on many levels, not just in terms of privatization of water and sanitation services, but also water resources. And I think a lot of that has also been, like in Spain, socializing, as we say in Spanish, socializing information, making information available to the public, and getting public input, getting sort of a people's movement around water, and getting people to articulate what they want around water. So the idea of, adapting or improving our understanding of the right to water based on needs on the ground, I think that's been such an important contribution that KruHa has made to all of us around the world. Míriam, I think, yeah, we'd love to hear more from your perspective in Spain. I'd love to hear about the people's indicators and the work you've been doing to democratize water management. I'd love to also hear more about the citizens water observatories.
Thank you, Meera. Voy a hablar en castellano también.
I will speak in Spanish.
Como ya se dice en el,
as I put it in the chat,
ya se ha estado diciendo, y los diferentes
and as
ponentes también,
it is not enough to just for the management to be public.
¿no? Es decir, que desde
we've started this campaign 10 years ago,
pero desde ahí es vida decimos, así como muchos de los movimientos de justicia hídrica, ¿no? En el
but
mundo,
it is not enough
que no es suficiente con
for the
que
management
la gestión
to
pase
be
al
controlled
público,
by the
control
state.
público, sino que necesitamos
We need to have a citizen's
ciudadano,
control. We need to have a citizenship that is informed, that is aware, and it may be able to participate
de las decisiones
in
del
the
agua,
water
como
management.
ya habéis dicho. Entonces, para esto,
So a bit inspired in the case of Paris
caso de París,
in 2017, when they remunicipalized that, and it was in a municipality with 200,000 inhabitants. They didn't only ask the city hall for it to be under the hands of the state, but they wanted the participation of the citizens. There should be a relationship between the operator, the city hall, and the community, the organized civil society. So this observatory is a decision-making space for deliberations, for articulations, and it is possible to create reports to be able to influence the different policies that emanate from the city hall. Because what we found was that these different mandates of 4 years make it very difficult for decisions that have to be on a long-term basis. Policies that have to think about the next 10, 15, 20 years. And so when we're thinking in terms of the politicians that sometimes are elected only for 4-year terms, we need to safeguard, as Lord was mentioning, safeguards that will allow us to propose decisions with the citizens' controls that are necessary in order to be able to face the challenges. In Catalonia, for example, and also all over the world, but we have a Mediterranean area with many droughts, and they will be more frequent from time to time. This is not an exception, and therefore there are decisions that cannot be made just thinking about the next 2 or 3 years, and we have been thinking about 80 years. So those observatories or those spaces, those participation spaces, they have a crucial role in this decision-making process, and they have not only to avoid privatization, as we said, a city hall may re-municipalize it and will take 2 or 3 terms, but then there's another government and suddenly wants to privatize it again. And if we don't have a body and we don't have a community that is organized with different actors from society to protect that, this system is always under threat. So in order to be able to have this participation with citizens, when we're talking about human rights, we're not only talking about this participation, we're talking about, we need information, we need transparency, as it has been said, and it is why from our organizations, we're working, Engineers Without Borders, we're working with those indicators that may be useful to assess water services under different perspectives. We need a gender perspective, intersectionalities, the right to water, participation, access to information, decision-making process, and the environmental perspective. There's a lot still to go. So those experiences, they are labs, they're experiments. So we have still a lot to go in order to go from the protest to the proposal. We need to be a movement with proposals, not only with protests. So we have proposals to be implemented, and we need, and I think that this is something that we have to take to this UN conference. We need the terms from the different international institutions and need to give support to the local governments for the implementation of different types of measures that don't only take into account this mantra, this myth of the efficiency, but also other aspects of life that are necessary.
Gracias, Míriam. I love that. We're not just about the protesta, we're about the propuesta. And on that note, I'll give you the floor, Leo. You have the last word before we move into the Q&A.
I will start where Míriam finished. You know, proposal, protest versus proposal. I think this is very important. I think that ONDAS has also tried to exercise that, to work with 2 agendas. One agenda would be to being there against privatization, to the resistance. Of course, we already know that it increases inequities, etc. But the other one is to strengthen public policies. And I think this is extremely important because in the great majority of the countries, the great majority of these operators, they are public owned, and many of them, they don't work in the best way possible. And there's a lot of to improve, and this is not, we don't have to blame one or another operator, but sometimes this public management occurs in an institutional environment that isn't the best. So I think that there are some elements that are important. One of them, and I need to mention that first of all, is the recognition of the human rights as the main guidance for the services. It is very good when a country approves and includes that in its constitution, when it is in their legislation that water and sanitation are human rights. It helps to organize the service. It is not enough. And the others, they are more stable public policies, public financing. Many governments, they don't use public resources in a proper way to invest in sanitation.
nos ensinou isso muitas
In
vezes,
Europe,
né? Na
they
Europa,
universalized
universalizou
its
os seus
services
serviços com
with
financiamento
public
público
funding
maciçamente, né? Com
massively,
priorização aos serviços de
prioritizing the
saneamento, né?
sanitation services.
A
The
questão da participação
democratic
democrática
participation
é
is
muito
very
importante, né?
important to
Para
disrupt
romper com
the
o
technicism that
tecnicismo que
many
muitas
times
vezes, né,
invades the
invade o
water
setor
and
de água e
sanitation
saneamento, né? Aquela
sector.
coisa de
The
que
idea that
os técnicos têm resposta
technicians
para
know
tudo,
everything,
conhecem
have
tudo, têm
solutions for
soluções para tudo,
everything.
não tem
They don't
necessidade
need to
de
hear
ouvir
and
e de
dialogue with
dialogar
anyone,
com a
hear
população. Então, a
anyone or
participação
dialogue.
é muito
And
importante.
planning,
Planejamento
long-term
de longo
planning is
prazo é
very
muito importante.
important
Nos
in the
países do sul global,
global
é muito
south.
comum
This is
ser muito
very
imediatista
important.
a
It's
forma como os
the
gestores pensam os
managers
serviços,
and
né? Então, é muito
people
importante
from the
fazer
public,
planejamento,
they
pensar
are
nas
very
mudanças,
immediatist.
inclusive
They
como
must
as
think
mudanças
about years
climáticas, né,
ahead,
afetam
especially with the
a
climate
continuidade dos
changes
serviços
and
e
the
o fortalecimento do prestador.
strengthening
É muito importante
of
investir no
the
fortalecimento
service
do
renderer
prestador local,
at
com
the local
capacitação,
level with
com boa
good
capacidade
capacity
técnica.
building,
Enfim,
good
eu penso que
training.
esse pacote,
And I
né,
think
de
that this
valorizar
package
o
of
público, né,
valuing
deve
the
vir junto,
public
de mãos
should
dadas, né,
come
com o
together with
pacote,
the
como a Míriam
package
falou,
of the
das
protests and
protestas, né? Das
proposals,
propostas e las
like
protestas
Míriam said,
em conjunto.
together,
Obrigado.
proposals and protests. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leo. So that concludes the presentations. We'll move into questions now. So we have quite a few in the chat. We have a question on the UN as a forum. Can you provide, and perhaps we'll look to Leo again for this, but if you can provide us an overview of the different actors involved in the upcoming UN conference, and what are the opportunities, who is supportive of water justice, of the water justice movement, and where are private sector interests being promoted? Is the World Bank and other private or other private corporations involved, especially because the narrative of the human right to water has been dominated by those actors. So this is a question from Marcela Gonzalez Rivas. Leo?
Bom, abraço para Marcela, que eu conheço.
I send
Bom,
greetings to Marcela, whom I know.
As Nações Unidas não é
The United
corpo
Nations is not a homogeneous
de pessoas, de
body of
propostas,
proposals, people,
existem
trends. There are
tendências
many
dentro das
different
Nações
trends.
Unidas.
There are
Existem
groups that are
são
very
muito
close to human
próximos aos
rights,
direitos humanos,
including some
inclusive
are
alguns
critical
críticos, não são muitos,
to
né?
the
Críticos à
privatization.
privatização.
Not
Não
all,
domina,
but some.
mas alguns são.
But I would
Mas eu
say
diria
that what prevails
prevalece
in the United
nas Nações
Nations
Unidas
is a
um
very
olhar muito
neutral
neutro,
kind
né?
of
Eles,
look
inclusive, as
or
agências
kind
usam
of
muito a palavra nós somos
perception.
agnósticos, né?
They
Em
say
relação
we are
ao tipo de
agnostic in terms
gestor.
of managers.
Não há uma crítica
There is not a
de fato
criticism
sobre
to
a privatização, por
privatization
exemplo, né?
specifically.
E isso, a
This,
meu
to my
ver,
understanding,
as
makes the
conclusões
conclusions
da
of the
conferência
March
de
conference
março
very
muito
unpredictable.
imprevisíveis, né? É muito
It's very
difícil
difficult
nós
to
fazermos
predict
uma previsão
what will
clara
happen,
sobre o que ocorrerá,
especially
mesmo
because
porque
the final
as
conclusions
conclusões
of the
finais da
conference
conferência
will be
serão muito
very
influenciadas
influenced
pelos
by the
países,
member
pelos
states.
Estados-membros, né?
They
Que
are the
são os que
ones that
votam, de
vote.
fato,
They are the
são
ones
os que
who
negociam os
negotiate
acordos,
the
são os que
treaties
negociam
and the
os tratados,
agreements.
né? Mas
But we
também
also
sabemos
know
que os
that the member
Estados-membros são muito
states are very
heterogêneos, né? Existem Estados
heterogeneous.
que
Some will
defenderão muito
defend very
claramente uma posição
clearly a
mais neutra,
neutral
etc.
position.
Então, eu
So
penso
I
que,
think that
se
if
é
it's
possível fazer
possible to
alguma
have a
previsão
prediction
sobre
of
o que
what will
ocorrerá em Nova
occur
York,
in New York,
de decisões
I think they will be
muito
very
neutras, né? Muito
neutral
pouco afirmativas, muito
decisions,
genéricas,
very
talvez seja a melhor
generic,
palavra.
very
Muito
neutral,
genéricas,
not very
decisões que vão
affirmative,
apontar de que precisamos
saying that
cumprir
we
com os
have to
ODS,
comply with the
né? Estamos
ODSs, we are
atrasados,
late, we
precisamos
must
recuperar
recover
o
the
tempo
time
perdido,
loss,
mas sem
the
deixar
time
muito
gap, but
claramente
without saying
como,
very
né? Por
clearly
quais
how,
meios, né?
with what,
Apenas com
by what
afirmações
means,
genéricas, precisamos
but
melhorar o
we
financiamento,
must improve
precisamos melhorar
funding,
a
we must
gestão,
improve the
precisamos melhorar
management
a
and
regulação,
regulation,
mas
but
como
how to
fazer
do
isso,
that,
né?
I don't
não me
think
parece que
that
vá ser
will be
parte
part
do
of
processo
the
decisório. Mas
decision-making
como
process.
se a gente tivesse uma
It's
bola
as
de
if we
cristal
had a
aqui
crystal
para
ball to
tentar
see
enxergar o
what's
que
going to
vai se
happen in the
passar na
conference.
conferência. You are mute. You are mute, Meera.
I'm sorry. It's been a long morning. So I would also encourage, thank you very much, Leo. I'd also encourage those who are interested to go onto the website of the UN Water Conference, and you can see some of the inputs proposed by different actors, including the World Bank, the OECD, UN Water, and you also get a sense of what those narratives are going to be. But as Leo said, you know, at the end of the day, at the UN, the decision makers are the member states. And so there are both opportunities, but there are lots of unknowns in that process. There's a question specifically on Spain. I don't know, Míriam, if you want to, you know, answer that question about Spain. Is Spain specifically invested in water privatization? Is that the role it's playing internationally? What is your sense of the Spanish agenda globally and also, I guess, domestically? Is there such a thing?
Yes, I can go in for just quickly.
The numbers I presented on Catalonia about privatization is 50%. It's smaller than Catalonia, which is 80%. But there is a perception of the private companies that they have great capacity to lobby within public policies. The government of Spain, as was mentioned about the role of privatization and cooperation, and they want to privatize the Spanish cooperation. For many years, we have been organizing this. We are cooperating with development, not only with private companies, but also with some public companies. And also, there has been denouncement against privatization in Spain. And we have certain organizations working, and we have public companies fighting against privatization. But in any way, the great presence of these private operators within Spain, they have the ability to influence the public sector and the government. And when somebody asked about the report on privatization and the human right to water, and when we saw the state of the contributions from Spanish operators, that first we have to analyze how many were private operators that had some management in Aguas de Barcelona, but I could not find the numbers. But if we look at this relationship, a great majority of them had the contribution of the Spanish state. This shows the ability to have lobby and to have an influence on the sector, because really, in the end, it leads to privatization of this type of service. There are several research that have analyzed this, done this privatization. None of them were accused, but there are some investigations underway. And they have a high power of influence protecting these companies. And in the case of the investigation of one company that took many years, they came to no conclusion. And these people were never really sued, on the opposite.
Great, thank you, Míriam. I'm going to direct the next question actually to David Hall, and maybe Leo, you can add. I know it's specifically about Sabesp in Brazil, but David, if you're able to comment on the financialization of public utilities and the impacts of financialization of public utilities, and how does that sort of impact their capacity to act in the public interest. And I'll combine that maybe with so that's a question from Tamara Zambiasi. And if you can speak specifically to Sabesp, great. Perhaps Leo, then you can add. But I'll combine that with Edson's question, Edson Aparecido de Silva's question about the importance of public financing in the quest for universal access. So this is, one of the strengths we have in the SDGs is we pushed, unlike the MDGs, its predecessor, which called for, numerical targets. I think it was 50% improvement, or the SDGs call for universal access, right? So now our governments are responsible for ensuring universal access to water and sanitation. So what is the role of public financing in that? David, if you could respond to those questions, and then maybe Leo will have something to add.
Yes, sorry, can you just summarize the question? I missed a little bit.
I guess the first, it's about financialization of public utilities, and how does that impact, what are the impacts of financialization? So you've got, the question was specifically about Sabesp, which is in theory, a public water company.
Yeah, Sabesp, yeah. Okay. Sabesp is a whole special subject in itself, I think. Yeah, in all sorts of ways. I mean, I think the answer to that has to be at the end of the democratic structures that we put in place. And so I don't think there's anything necessarily bad about having a corporatized structure for a municipal company, and in a number of many countries now it's the only structure available, so we shouldn't get too worked up about it. You can always regenerate the account. And so, for example, in Germany you have a lot of municipal Stadtwerke that have that kind of structure and aren't necessarily terrible. However, once you start getting partly quoted on the stock exchange even if it's just through bonds, then you start literally installing a private capital driving interest into the heart of the company, and that really should not be done. There was an interesting example of that being reversed recently in France in relation to energy, because that's what France had done with its old national energy company, Électricité de France, EDF, 20 years ago now. I think they privatized it by putting 20% or 24% on the stock market, or 16%. Anyway, once the French government said, we are going to stop EDF from making profits out of the energy price rises simply by capping what EDF charges to consumers, the private shareholders said, well, that's absolutely terrible. That completely destroys the whole point of having a company. We don't want our shares anymore. You can renationalize the whole lot. Terrific, good result. And I think that's an illustration of how it's through the political dynamic of insisting that these public companies have to operate always and only on the basis of achieving public goods, that the protection against, as it were, the corruption of public sector companies by private objectives can be looked for. However, Leo will probably say that's far too simple a response to the problem of Sabespe. But I think in general terms, we have to look at the political control systems rather than get too hung up about the corporate structure itself.
Thanks, David. And I think it's also true that the local context matter, right? And that it how much power. So I mean, it's great to have the example of France. It's also a question of how much power the public operator has vis-a-vis the private financiers, perhaps. And there has been some interesting research in the US on when it's a racially segregated environment like Flint, Michigan, or Detroit, that there you've seen impacts on Black people, racialized working class people, because of the pressures that the private financiers can exert on municipalities. But it all depends on the local politics and the local context, for sure. Leo, do you have anything to add specifically on Sabesp?
Sim, vou tentar ser rápido. Mas é caso muito interessante. Talvez muitos aqui não conheçam. A Sabesp é a companhia do estado de São Paulo.
Try to be brief. I'll try to be brief. There's a very interesting case in São Paulo. They operate like for water for 30 million inhabitants, I guess. And some decades ago, the capital of the company was open to the stock market. And today, the government of São Paulo owns 51% and 49% are open shares in the market, including in the New York stock market. And so it's a company that has a hybrid characteristic and has similarities and differences from a private company. I would risk to say it has more similarities than differences. It's more like a private company. What is different is that the board of directors is appointed by the governor and not by the shareholders. So we have public agents directing the company, but the body that is very strong is the administration council, and there the influence of shareholders, private shareholders, is very strong. And the Sabesp, as other companies, transfers dividends, very high dividends, to outside of the sanitation area. Part of it goes to the government, but almost half goes to the shareholders. And it's a resource that leaves the sanitation area. And the government does not use this resource to expand the system, to make investments. So in that sense, there is not much difference from the profit transfer. But it's an interesting case to analyze. But in summary, I would insist that it's very close to a private company.
Okay, thanks, Leo. And perhaps that also explains or answers one of the questions on the difference between how a particular structure, a particular model might operate in the global north versus the global south. That was one of the questions in the chat. I'll actually skip right to David Boyce's to give Sigit the chance, because it's specifically on Jakarta. David Boyce asks, to what extent do national presidential politics prevent the return to public water in Jakarta, given that Indonesia wants to show that it is open to foreign investors? Also, that the governorship of Jakarta is the stepping stone to the presidency. Sigit, would you like to take that question?
Yeah, of course, the national politics shows the problem of neoliberalism, which is increasingly pervasive in Indonesia. For example, Jokowi, who is referred by many people as the people's president, turns out to be only an extension of the neoliberal and oligarchic regime. Likewise, presidential candidates who have started campaigning, such as Anies, the former governor of Jakarta, who recently who recently over his what do we call recently resigned from his office. Only give a lot of chemic statement, like he wants to stop the privatization in Jakarta, and wants to nationalize the water operator, and so on, and many what do we call as nationalism term, something like that. But the actual do that what he did last, I think, a couple months ago, in the October or November, he also signed or contributing to facilitate the new assignment of the new contract. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Sigit. I want to also get to the question actually on gender dynamics. So the impacts of privatization on gender equality. Míriam, I don't know if you want to take that question, or anyone else.
Well, I can respond because we've studied that here in Barcelona at local level, and we made a study about how energy poverty affected women. Otra vez, cambio, I changed to Spanish. Hicimos un estudio sobre cómo...
So we did a study about how
cómo impactaba la pobreza
there was
energética,
an
incluyendo también la pobreza
impact, how
hídrica,
the
sobre las
energetic
mujeres aquí en
and
Barcelona.
water poverty would actually
Porque
affect women in
está muy
Barcelona,
estudiado,
because
¿no? El impacto
it has been studied, the
no
impacts
concretamente
have
de la
been studied, not
privatización, aquí
necessarily of the
pero lo estudiamos en
privatization,
Barcelona,
to
donde
say,
tanto el
but we
agua
studied
como
that in
la
Barcelona, not
electricidad
only where
está
water, but
privatizada.
electricity is privatized.
Y un poco lo que vimos, que para nosotros fue interesante porque conocemos mucho sobre el impacto diferenciado de las mujeres en el acceso al agua
learn a lot
en el sur
about
global,
the
pero
differentiated
nos cuesta
impact
traducir
on
también el
women
impacto
in the global
cuando no se
south,
tiene
but
acceso
it
al
is
agua en el norte
difficult
global. Y lo que
when we
vimos era que
to
también
translate
eran
that
las
and
mujeres
to
las que tenían
discuss
la
that
carga
in the global north. But
para
nevertheless, we
gestionar
saw
un
that
poco
it were the
todo
women
el
that had
acceso
to
a las
manage
ayudas. Es decir, que
the
cuando
access to the
no
subsidies,
tenían dinero
meaning
para pagar el
that
agua,
when they didn't have money to
aquí
pay
hay
the
que hacer
water,
muchísimas gestiones
here
para poder
there are a
acceder
lot of
a descuentos
things
en la
that you have to
factura
do to be
o que no
bureaucracy
te
to be
corten el
able to have
agua y sigas
access
teniendo agua cuando no puedes
to the
pagar. Y
subsidies for you to
todas estas
avoid
gestiones
having your water cut. So
en la
all
mayoría
this
se realizaban
usually in
por
the
mujeres,
majority was
¿no?
done by women.
Entonces, aquí el hecho de la
So the
privatización lo que supone es que en muchos casos
the question of
la
privatization is that in
gestión
most
para
of
poder
cases,
acceder al agua cuando no puedes pagar es más
all
difícil
the
que cuando tienes una gestión
bureaucracy
municipal pública
that is
que se
done
puede automatizar las ayudas
is very
directamente, se
difficult to
pueden
do.
poner a
And when it's
disposición
public
otros
management,
mecanismos que en el caso de gestión
the
privada son
mechanisms
más
are
difíciles
easier.
de acceder debido a la
It is more difficult to have
falta de
access to those
transparencia
private
y a la opacidad en la gestión.
mechanisms because there is a lack of transparency.
Thank you, Míriam. So there's a question. I know, David, you talked about environmental impacts of privatization. I wonder if you can take the question by Maria Gil Beros on whether these companies, whether private companies are reporting on water quality issues, and whether, you know, water quality is that an important place where we can intervene, where we can put pressure and fight back against private companies?
Yeah, it's that's one area where the UK experience is quite encouraging. The water companies have been obliged to monitor and report sewage overspills, for example. Originally, by accident, as I understand it, that a Conservative government minister said that companies were obliged to monitor and report these things, and when his officials told him, no, they're not actually, Minister, you're going to have to apologize and say you got it wrong, he said, no, just send out a letter now telling them as from now they're obliged to. So we do actually have data. However, we also have active citizens movements, and with something like environmental impact, you can actually organize citizen movements to do that monitoring yourselves. And this is what has happened in the UK. In fact, they've been very important. The people, the Surfers Against Sewage, is one of our most radical political groups now, and the members are monitoring and identifying and reporting all the sewage overflows into the sea. Similarly with river groups, and so these groups can and do produce reports themselves to identify not just where the problems are, but what the causes are. So these groups have identified that it's not just something that happens when there's a lot of rain or whatever. It's because there's insufficient capacity in the wastewater treatment plants and so on. So the answer is yes on both counts. But it is very important. It goes back to the point about what system we should be constructing, not just sort of complaining, but we should want a system that is geared to monitoring what's happening to the environment on a almost instant basis. That there are systems available, as I understand from engineers, that can give very early warnings of things like sewage flooding happens, and enable people to do early management of them and so on and so forth. But all this depends on public discussion and decision making and giving people those access. But citizen organized monitoring is very important with the environment, very effective, I think.
Great, thank you, David. There's also a question on the power of private sector lobby groups on the media. I don't know who wants to take that question, but the way all of the disinformation about public water management, how do we address that? I think the question is from Brazil, where Juliano Falsao Ribeiro feels that that battle is being lost in the media.
Maybe I can talk a little bit about Brazil. Bom, isso está nitidamente acontecendo no Brasil.
Well, this is clearly happening in Brazil. The communications, they are saying that they give a lot of space to those neoliberal economists for them to explain about water and sanitation. There's almost no space for social movements. There is a struggle going on, and unequal, asymmetrical battle occurring. Of course, the alternative means of communication, they do show a bit of the opinion of the academy, but the public opinion is influenced by the TV and radio, and there is no space for a different thought. There's just one solution, which is privatization. So there's only one narrative. It is very difficult to face that. Those conservative traditional means of communication, and Brazil is going through a transition process where the Lula government is in its first phases of sanitation policies. There holds a lot of tension, and there's different ways of looking at it, and the media, unfortunately, is always advocating for a neoliberal solution.
Thanks, Leo. So I just one more question, then there are a few questions, in fact, if I can kind of combine them on inequality and the kind of deeper inequalities in the global south with some of these same models, but also there's a question on informal settlements. I know this is something that KruHa has been working on, is that, you know, people living in informal settlements, people living in poor neighborhoods end up paying a lot more for water under private management. If anyone wants to comment on sort of, you know, deeper inequalities and the impacts on poor people. Oh, I thought we had lost Sigit, but I see he's there. I don't know if you want to comment on that quickly, Sigit, or?
Can you repeat your question?
Just the impacts of privatization specifically in informal settlements and poor people. I know that that's been a big part of KruHa's campaign.
Yeah, you know,
and or I don't know if
yeah.
if it's informal settlements,
yeah,
or kampungs, or
in gray area or illegal area, which they call as the neighborhood. I mean the governor or the deputy called as a gray area or illegal area. They are excluded to access the water services from the legal services. I mean, and also you know, they cannot or the Pamjaya could not extend or intervene this area because they should you know, they should get approved by the private operator, and sometimes you know, they are obligated to rely on alternative mechanism like that are often exploitative and expensive, like master meter or kiosk water, or depending on bottled water or groundwater that already, you know, polluted or like that have an impact from the seawater. Yes, something like that. That they are the communities that actually have to pay more, or have to pay more than, you know, the maybe middle class or something like that lives in a formal area, or what they call as a legal area. So they are the victim of the privatization, because they get least water, or even, you know, polluted water because of this the whole privatization system. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks again. Yeah, and I think that's important because in Indonesia, in the court cases, in the Jakarta Coalition's court case against the private water operators, people living in kampungs and low-income neighborhoods led that struggle, right? Their stories were very important in fighting the private operator. Also important in the context of this UN conference, where the World Bank and the OECD are now saying, look, our research shows that poor people are willing to pay. So let's create systems where poor people can continue to pay more and pay for their services. So, you know, they're, you know, promoting technologies like the kind of kiosk technologies, or there's a big water charity, water.org, run by Matt Damon, promoting microfinancing in water and sanitation, because supposedly, look, poor people pay more, and therefore they're a good market for these products. products rather than extending public services that we all benefit from to poorer neighborhoods. So I think we just have a few minutes left. If anyone wants to add anything, I would like to highlight that we have one more event in this series of webinars. Míriam, I don't know if you want to say anything about the upcoming webinar on community, public community water partnerships.
Just to solo animar a que se apunten.
I just would like to stimulate you to participate, to enroll. We have
iniciativas,
different initiatives.
De promoción de acuerdos
And we
la
promote
propuesta que
public communitarian agreements.
Hacemos
and that's what we're actually doing to actually change, to reverse this privatization trend.
Donde los usuarios, ¿no?
La ciudadanía se reapropie del servicio, no solo en los casos de privatización, sino en los casos de gestión pública o en los casos donde the public
la gestión del agua
management and the water management as such. Thank you.
And also, Míriam, maybe I'll just give you the floor again, but we also have a petition circulating. If you want to say a few words on the petition, but this is a petition, this is Water Justice Manifesto, articulating some of our demands for the UN Water Conference. Do you want to say anything more on that and where people can go to sign the petition?
Pues ponemos el link en el,
We're going to put the link
en el chat. I don't know if we've put it the link. I missed it, but we can put the link to the form. So you can endorse this manifesto. I'm going to change to Spanish again. Sorry for that. Este manifiesto que hemos estado
this manifesto that we've been working on with different movements, with different actors in the struggle for water, in order to be able to reach some basic aspects to prepare for the summit in New York. So we want those signatures in order for different organizations,
para que diferentes organizaciones y eso también académicos
and for the academy, for professors, but also individually, we want those signatures. And the idea is to be able to take it to the water conference of the UN in order for those basic aspects. And you have here the different languages and there's
del manifiesto.
And I would like to thank, because it has been a very difficult job in order to be able to try to summarize, to condense all the proposals or the demands of the movement in some basic, straightforward points that may be able to have some space in this summit of the UN in order to be able to take the proposals from our movement. So we don't know what the impact this will have because this conference is unforeseeable. But the more support we have, the better it will be, and more probability we will have to have a good effect.
That list of languages is actually growing. We'll soon have it translated into African languages. It's a decentralized horizontal effort. So we publish on all of your websites. It's available to all of you to publish on your websites. Please sign. You can sign as individuals. You can sign as organizations. We really want it to be sort of a strong collective push for our global demands around water justice at this meeting. As Míriam said, we don't know what the impacts of the meeting are going to be, what our capacity to influence those meetings will be, but us coming together like this to construct collective narratives, to learn from each other and replicate our victories. This is how we have been winning against privatization. It's by coming together bringing these struggles back to our homes. And so let's continue to do that. I think Blue February has already been a victory. It's already been a powerful moment for us to come together and learn from each other. So thank you to all my speakers for contributing to that effort of constructing common narratives and sharing knowledge. Thank you, David Hall, Leo Heller, Míriam Planas, and Sigit Budiono. We'll see you at the next webinar.